Thank you for downloading this podcast from the Forum for Philosophy. Subscribe for weekly discussions of science, culture, politics, and the arts from a philosophical perspective. The Forum is a non-profit organisation, and our events are free and open to all. You can support our work via our website and Facebook page.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Forum for Philosophy. This event is about immigration detention. As you may know, the Forum for Philosophy is an educational charity. We host free public events, and we also produce podcasts and run a philosophy blog. We are funded by donations, so please do feel free to support us via our Just Giving page, which you can find on our website. And while you're there, do check out our list of exciting forthcoming events. Tonight's event is being recorded, although we do ask that you don't take photographs. Please do wait for the roving microphone when you're asking a question. Please also turn off your phones or put them on silent, but do feel free to tweet along with us. You can see our hashtag there. It's hashtag LSE Forum. Now on to our discussion. Thousands of foreign nationals are held in immigration detention across the country. Some are detained on arrival, others after having lived here for years. Some will be deported, and others will be released. Currently in the UK, there is no time limit on how long a person can be held in immigration detention. Tonight, we're going to be reflecting on the politics and philosophy of immigration detention. We're going to be thinking about what this practice reveals about systems of migration control, about conceptions of political membership, respect for human rights, and the ideals that supposedly animate democratic political institutions. My name is Sarah Fine from the Department of Philosophy at King's College London, just over the road, and I'm a fellow here at the Forum for Philosophy. I'm delighted to be chairing tonight's panel, and now I'll introduce our fantastic panel of volunteers. So at the far end we have Mishka. Mishka is a member of Freed Voices. Freed Voices is a group of experts by experience committed to speaking out about the realities of immigration detention in the UK and calling for reform. Mishka is not his real name, and he asks that we don't take photographs of tonight's event. To my right, we have Professor Mary Bosworth. Mary Bosworth is Professor of Criminology, Director of the Centre for Criminology and Director of Border Criminologies, and a Fellow of St Cross College at the University of Oxford. She's also Professor of Criminology at Monash University. And in the middle, we have Professor Matthew Gibney. Matthew Gibney is Elizabeth Colson Professor of Politics and Forced Migration, Director of the Refugee Studies Centre, and Official Fellow of Linacre College at the University of Oxford. Thank you all so much for joining us. So I'm going to ask our panel a series of questions, and in the middle we'll be breaking for participation from all of you. So the first question I'm going to ask tonight is, what is immigration detention and what role is it supposed to serve? And could we start with you, Mary? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for showing up on this wet and windy evening. The short answer is, of course, that immigration detention is an administrative form of custody in the immigration system that is used to hold people in the United Kingdom, at any rate, mainly pursuant to deportation. So it's a system of custody that is primarily designed to hold people in order to facilitate their deportation. You can also be placed in immigration detention while, under certain circumstances, while your asylum claim is being considered, and also under certain circumstances while an identification process is underway to determine your nationality and whether you have the right to be in the United Kingdom. It works differently in different countries, of course. So in the United Kingdom, primarily immigration detention is used for people who have come to the end of their migration process. That's what it's designed for, and it's designed, as I said, to facilitate their deportation. In other countries, it's used often as a point of entry. So if you arrive and there's something with your documents, or indeed you claim asylum, then you may be placed in detention. And so Australia, for instance, used to do that quite a lot. They now have a fairly complicated system of immigration detention, which we may get onto, called community detention. But anyway, so one of the difficulties about talking in general about detention is that it varies enormously country to country. And the sort of model that's in my head most of the time is the British one, because that's where I do most of my research. But if I was to think about the United States, for instance, where my colleague Yolanda, who's sitting at the front, has a lot of expertise on, I would be having to think about a whole different kind of set of institutions, uses of tents, detention of children, separation of families, all of those sorts of practices. I go to Greece quite a lot, and their detention works slightly differently. It's very much an add-on to the reception centre process, so there's a lot of fluidity between the asylum seeking process and the detention process. So what detention is surprisingly difficult to really put your finger on, actually.
Thank you very much. Could you just tell us a little bit about these kind of words that we hear a lot around detention, like immigration removal centres? We know some people are being held in prisons. What are these different facilities and what are the different rules governing them?
Okay. So currently in the United Kingdom there are 7 immigration removal centres. They've been called immigration removal centres since 2001, and the name is meant to signify their purpose, that they're there to remove people. And immigration removal centres are, by and large, built to prison design, but they're not prisons. Even when they are sometimes run by the prison service, they're still not prisons. So they run according to the detention centre rules, and everybody who's in a detention centre is not serving a sentence. They are there because of their immigration case. You can be a detainee in a prison, and almost always that would be because you are a foreign national. This has been flagged during your prison sentence. This process is now embedded in the prison service, so you're asked very early on what your citizenship status is, and if they don't believe you, they check. And so you can be held at the end of your criminal sentence in a prison under Immigration Act rules. And so you're not a prisoner at that point, even though you are actually in a prison.
Thank you very much. Mishka.
Yeah, it's great to be here today. And I think Mary gave a brilliant introduction about what's immigration detention. From my side, I would say immigration detention is, I can describe it as holding people in prison-like settings for the administrative convenience of the Home Office. And the government says, to facilitate the removal of people who do not have right to be in this country. But having said that, I thought maybe since Mary gave a good introduction about what's immigration detention, I thought I'm going to break down the ideal definition what the government is using. They say immigration detention is a practice they use to facilitate the removal of people, and they also say we detain people only as the last resort. At the same time, they say we detain people only for the shortest time possible. So I thought maybe I will describe how it's the way the government is presenting immigration detention and the realities around it. To use an example, I can use it like this. Every time I see the Home Secretary or the Home Office, they present immigration detention as a nice, beautiful cake. It is covered with nice, a lot of icing, cherries on top, but when you cut it, it's a brick inside. So that's how I can describe what's immigration, the realities around immigration detention and how the government basically present it or how they try to justify it. Like I said, we have there are countless issues around immigration detention, but I'm sure we will be talking about this as the discussion is progressing. But we just break down 3 things. The government says they use detention only as a last resort, but in this country, averagely around 24,000 people are detained every year. That means 24,000 last resorts per year. So 24,000 is not a small number. In the meantime, they say like they detain people only for the shortest time possible. But I mean, like Mary described, I mean, UK is a bit unique compared to other countries, especially European countries, because there's no maximum time limit on how long someone can be detained. As a result, people can be detained days, weeks, months, sometimes years. And in our group, we have one member who joined recently. He said, like, even I was surprised when he described that he has been in immigration detention for 4 years and 9 months, which is almost 5 years. Now he's living in the community. And the last thing they say, like, we detain people to facilitate the removal and or deportation from the UK. But in reality, I mean, when I check the latest immigration detention statistics, 60% of the people who are detained, they are released back into the community. So it's not that simple. I mean, government say, okay, even though those people are released back into the community, the suffering for those people does not, end from there. One good way to describe that experience is one of our members said, like, you leave detention, but detention does not leave you. So, yeah, I thought maybe it's good in that way I describe how the immigration detention is presented and the realities around immigration detention, given that, Mary gave a good introduction about immigration detention. I thought, like, I do not have to again describe what's immigration detention. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mishka. And Matt?
Sure. So I have the deficit of speaking after two good introductions to detention. What I thought I might do, though, is talk about is drill down a little bit to what the kind of perhaps the real motivations for detention are, or the ones that are kind of less connected sometimes to the explicit ones and formal ones given by the state. And I would say there are three types of motivations that explain the use of detention, but specifically in the UK, but I think they have general implications beyond that. The first, and these are not in order of importance, in fact I wouldn't put them in order of importance like this, but the first is that immigration detention is a kind of spectacle, in the sense that it is a way of embodying the toughness, the willingness of the government to enforce strict immigration policies. Now, if we think about something like immigration control itself, members of the public don't get out there standing at Heathrow looking at people come in and come out or counting the numbers and things like that. So they only have a kind of mediated view, I suppose, of the extent to which immigration control is actually being operated here and whether it is strict or liberal. But these moments, these kind of institutions like detention, when they come into the media and when the public talks about them, they provide a kind of symbolic or a kind of spectacle, a kind of resource that the government can use to show that it is not treating. It's not a soft touch. It is. It's trying to operate restrictive policies and has the wherewithal and the means to do so. And I think historically one sees that after moments of political controversy over asylum and non-citizens, and I can go back to the early 2000s and asylum under the Blair government, and then the foreigner prisoner scandal in 2006, 2007, that's when we see deportation numbers rising in those particular moments, and much more talk about it as well. So it's used in some ways to solve the credibility problem of the state, I'd say. The second feature of deportation that I would bring up is that there's an issue of the efficacy. It makes it more efficacious carrying out the practice of deportation. At least this is what state officials think. Deportation is not an easy practice, particularly for liberal states. It's a controversial practice, and deportation helps in two ways. Detention helps in two ways. First of all, it fixes the location of particular individuals that could be anywhere in the community, and therefore that facilitates the practice of getting them where the state wants them, potentially getting them onto flights, potentially getting them into some kind of carrier that can get them off the territory of the state, and perhaps makes people more pliable to participate in terms of those practices of expulsion because they're worn down by the experience of detention too. A second feature of efficacy, which I think is really important, is that it prevents the social integration of non-citizens. And social integration here and preventing it is important for the state for a couple of reasons. One, because if you pull people out of the community, they don't have those kinds of moral claims of connections to the community that might serve to challenge in some ways the state's account of them being simply non-members tout court. And it creates them more as people that it connects them to criminology and factors like that. But secondly, it also deprives people of the kinds of allies that they might make in the social community who may then come to contest deportation. And states generally don't want to be seen to be plucking people out of communities when there are big demonstrations against the removal or the detaining of those people. Now, a third feature, just quickly, that I would mention as well is, and continuously since the early 2000s, there's an element of deterrence in the whole construction of the detention estate. Detention is not supposed to be justified by the act of deterrence, but it is, I think, a very central feature of it. There's a hope, there's an aspiration by the government that the threat of detention will facilitate self-deportation, as Mitt Romney once called it, the idea that people may go home under their own resources or go home under voluntary return programs. And it also just raises the stakes of people arriving and staying in the country unlawfully or perhaps at the end of a lawful visa. And, you know, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, said about a month ago that she wanted criminal justice policies that strike terror into the hearts of criminals. And I think that offers at least some insight into the way some people are thinking here. And if you were to turn that into the realm of non-citizens and detention, detention is also a way of striking a certain degree of terror into non-citizens in the polity.
Thank you so much. That's making me think a little bit about something that comes out very much in your work, Mary, about how detention and deportation are both a kind of site in which the state shows its power, but also in another way its powerlessness, because detention and deportation, well, the final end of removal and deportation require the participation of other states, and in many cases that's very difficult to secure, particularly where documents aren't available and you're waiting for a long time for states to reciprocate and so on. So I wondered if you might be able to say a little bit about that.
Yes, sure. And I guess, I mean, also partly in response to what Matt said, it's not that I disagree with you, Matt. I think these are all important points, but I do think there is a confounding aspect that as a system it's really small, and it's getting smaller. I mean, there's been a massive decarceration. So at the moment, I think there's about 2,400 people. And also, even the issues to do with long-term detention has also dropped significantly. So the vast majority of people are actually gone quite quickly. That doesn't necessarily mean that their case is resolved. There's been a kind of increase in redetention practices. But there is a modesty to the system. It's a small system, and so it's absolutely the case for the people who are caught up in it that I think these things are relevant. Possibly deterrence, certainly fear, all the difficulties that freed voices are so good at explaining and describing. But I think we do need to make sense of the willingness and the desire to expend quite so much effort on a system that's actually no bigger than a kind of big inner city high school. And that's the bit which I always come back to. I remain, actually, despite having done research on this for a decade, I remain slightly confused about what people are trying to do. And I'm leaning more towards the idea that there's not, that maybe thinking about it in those terms, about what they're trying to do, is perhaps just an oversimplification of the state, and that this idea that the state has a plan. I think maybe, and that probably isn't your view. I mean, you probably don't think the state has a plan, but like I think sometimes I probably fall into that era of thinking that. And I think you see this most clearly in exactly what you said then, Sarah, that in the ways in which the system can actually just not work because somebody doesn't have the right piece of paper, or their embassy refuses to give it to them. And I mean, eventually they probably will get rid of that person if they can indeed document them. There are people who I think it's very, very difficult to do, and the difficulty is that, of course, the period of time, if there's no time limit, and there's no time limit both in detention and in the community without status, that experience just goes on and on and on, and can be incredibly painful. But there's lots of moments where whatever the desire has been of managing somebody, that actually quite small actions can make that very difficult.
And what about this time factor? It's something that you mentioned, Mishka, that we just don't have a time limit. I mean, how has that happened? How do we have this system that allows people to be detained indefinitely?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit surprising, to be honest. It has been happening for a long time unchallenged, but of course now there are like huge amount of campaigns happening around this, and this time limit is something that is linked to, I would say, significant mental health deterioration of people. And it's a bit surprising, like you say, I mean, when it comes to other areas of law, so we have time limit even under Mental Health Act. I mean, there are specific time limit. Someone can be basically detained under terrorist regulations as well, terrorism regulations. But when it comes to this immigration purpose, I mean, there's no time limit on how long someone can be detained. And it has been happening for a long time, and how it started is not something, probably maybe it started a long time ago. I'm not sure when it started, but I would say significant issues around immigration detention are definitely linked to this lack of a time limit. And if we have a time limit, I mean, we do campaign for a time limit, but it doesn't mean that we justify the continuation. I mean, we don't justify the immigration detention, saying that, okay, if there's a time limit, that's fine, you can carry on with detention. So the point of, I mean, if we have a time limit, I think it could reduce the use of detention, both in scale and as well as both in length as well. As a result, I mean, less and less people will be detained, and maybe, I mean, it could even eventually lead to close of some detention centers. But I mean, there has been like lots of independent evidence supporting the time limit, even though the government is not quite willing to listen to it. But I would say the pressure is mounting, independent evidence is mounting, and hopefully a day will come where the government will decide to, okay, I mean, we should eventually think of introducing a time limit on how long someone can be detained. So
just on that, I mean, I think to a certain extent what one has here is just the resistance of the British state to have anything that in some ways constrains itself, any self-imposed constraints in the realm of immigration control generally. Even if that indefinite time limit means that, I mean, it means a lot to the people involved, but in terms of the number of people going through detention, by the vast number are out of detention within 2 months, certainly 3 months. So at the risk of kind of generating more tension with Mary, I think we just have to ask about the kind of symbolic purposes then that detention serves in these cases, and the resistance to that, that ability to indefinitely detain. And there I would probably come back to this idea of partly deterrence, partly spectacle, partly a history of the British state not wanting to be constrained, in particular by the courts and to a certain extent public opinion in those realms, a history that is seen in other areas as well, but it's perhaps become a bit stronger over the last couple of decades.
Well, let's continue this conversation with the audience. In a moment, I'm going to ask our panel about whether or not they think there could be a legitimate version of detention and what might be alternatives to detention. But does anybody have any questions about what we've heard so far and want to develop some of these themes further? Do hold on for the roving mic. I'm going to call on this person in the grey T-shirt. Wait. Just coming with the mic. Thank you so much. Just 1 second. And do I see any more? And I'll take you right after. Thank you very much. And then you after that. Just here. Thank you.
My question was, if there was indeed a time limit instituted and someone reached that time limit, what then would happen to them?
Thank you very much, and a nice short question. Perfect.
I was just going to ask Mishka to say a bit more about what it's like inside. You've already said a bit about, I have the impression that you're not very positive about what it's actually like, but I just wondered what there was by way of, like, what do people do in there all day, and how closely does it resemble just a prison, and what other kind of provision is made for people in those places?
Great, thank you. And then we've got a third question which I'll take before coming back to the panel.
Hi, thanks for that introduction. I'm just wondering, where do we see the role of race and racism in this debate? And so, for example, we know in the Australian example, the people who are held in immigration detention tend to be of a certain background. And I'm just wondering, how important is it to emphasize in our discussion of this topic the influence of race and racism?
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'll just stop there for a moment and deal with these three fantastic questions. So first of all, well, if somebody did reach this hypothetical time limit, then what? And then the question about what's it like? We've described it as prison-like. It obviously differs from prison in that there's no time limit at present. So if we could talk a little bit more about the day-to-day experience. And then finally, obviously a key theme in your work, race and racism, and where they feature in discussions about detention. Mishka, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would say, let's say if we introduce a time limit after 28 days, I think that goes hand in hand with what's the purpose of detention in the first place. I mean, if the government say we detain people to facilitate the removal, and if the government cannot, let's say, remove someone within a certain time period, that means the government has to release that person into the community. So I believe, if the government at one stage during someone's detention, if they realize, we cannot remove this person, they cannot use detention as a quarantine facility. It's the purpose of detention is to facilitate removal, so that we believe a 28-day, and because we have other specific time limits when it comes to other areas of law. In the meantime, I think when it comes to Home Office itself has a time limit. When it comes to removing or deportation people, they say 28 days is sufficient for them to facilitate that. If the government cannot do it, that means the person should be living in the community. So that's why we need alternatives to immigration detention, which we will be covering as this discussion is, progressing. So we believe, if the government cannot remove or deport someone, that means the person should be living in the community rather than using detention as a human storage facility.
Thank you. Matt?
Well, these questions are probably more geared to the other presenters, but I think it's a good question on race, and I'd be interested to hear Mary talk about the kind of figures on this, or at least the kind of construction of immigration detainees.
No facts.
Well,
no
if
facts.
not, because at least your experience. But I think, and this is preempting a little bit of what I'll I'll move on to say a bit later, perhaps. But we have to ask the question of why this liberty violation, which is such a kind of powerful liberty violation, which brings us back to this idea of indefinite detention, is tolerated by the public. And is it because, as seems something that's fairly reasonable, I think, to surmise, because people just don't, in a sense, value the lives of the people that are detained? I mean, in some ways, there's some kind of barrier placed between their normal understanding of what justice would be and the experiences of these people involved. So we need to ask the question, and it's a hypothetical question. We don't really have much to answer it with. But what would happen if it was all white Australians being detained? Would we still be in the situation where we are talking about having some time limits on the use of detention? And I'm quite sceptical about that too. I mean, race is not the only factor here. It's also intersecting with conceptions of criminality, which are at work in the broader prison complex as well too. But I think it's a very good question just to be pinning down this issue of race, because it does, I think, run like a red thread through many of these policies where government power seems to be closest to at its centre.
Yeah, and your mention of Australia leads nicely into thinking about the way in which detention is connected to Britain's imperial and colonial past and how that's represented through the members of people in detention.
Yes, so I mean, detention centres are by and large filled with people from former British colonial territories, but not so many white Australians and New Zealanders and Canadians. It's not just people from the global south, however, it's also people from recent areas of war, and which some of which are also former British colonial territories, of course. And then there are quite a few Eastern Europeans who are in detention, and that population. I was laughing before with Matt because I'm hopeless with facts, so I'm afraid I can't tell you how many of which population there are and what have you. But the Home Office does publish these. You can always see who the top 5 nationalities are, and it's very common that Polish nationals and also Albanians and Romanians are sort of up there. And recently, before they've restarted the charter flights, those numbers, I think, were going up a little bit because it's a little bit easier to deport to places like Poland and Romania and Albania. So clearly, on the whole, these are places which are filled with people from the global south. On the whole, most of the people who work in these places are white, although that's not entirely uniform. And so some of the ones that are near Heathrow, the 2 that are near Heathrow, they actually have quite a diverse workforce because, by and large, IRCs, like prisons, hire locally. So your local workforce near the airport are people who live in Slough. Slough is one of the most ethnically diverse parts of the UK. So race and racism are there, but they're complicated, and they're extremely interesting in how people understand and relate to each other. Just going back to the time limit question, just a few points. One is there is already a time limit for some people in detention. So families with children have a time limit. Pregnant women have a time limit. And then there are other countries. I mean, one of the reasons we don't have a time limit is because Britain never signed up to the Returns Directive. This is all now going to be unimportant. But that's, all the EU countries, they all signed up to it. They all had a time limit. The upper end was 18 months. For a long time, many European countries had much shorter time limits, and increasingly they've stretched it out now to the maximum of 18 months. I have written a little bit about France, which for a very long time had quite a rigid time limit of 35 days and sort of judicial oversight in between. France does a lot of detaining and deportation. The time limit didn't really restrain that. France also at least according to NGOs who presumably know what they're talking about, is sometimes a little cavalier about where they're sending people back to, so they're not always completely certain that this is the right document for that person, but close enough. And they also don't necessarily offer much in the way of community housing and things like that. So there are unanticipated consequences of having the time limit be the issue that you think is going to fix the problems. And that's not to say I don't support a time limit. I do think there should be a time limit, but I don't think, as Mishka said, I don't think that you could then sort of say, okay, we have a time limit and now it's all fine, because that would be wrong.
One point just often made about a time limit as well is if you have a time limit like 28 days, the officials will work towards that time limit rather than it will become the kind of idée fixe. But then, they'll slow things down and just release people just before the time limit. So potentially the amount of time they spend in detention for some people may increase.
Just to add, when it comes to 28-day time limit, we say that's the maximum upper limit. It doesn't mean that people are going to be there 28 days. In the meantime, of course, there's going to be, if it's a proper system, there has to be judicial oversight in between, so that the Home Office can say, okay, we have a 28-day time limit, so that we are going to detain people for 28 days. It's going to be the maximum, but in the meantime, it can change the mindset of Home Office staff as well. If they know, okay, we cannot remove someone within this 28 days, and that's the maximum time limit, that means they can probably release people earlier than that, because what happens is now, since there's no time limit, Home Office, they know, we can keep people in detention as long as we want, even if there's no realistic prospect of removal or deportation. So, but Mary mentioned, I think if you have a time limit, you have to, in the meantime, focus on other areas as well, such as alternatives to immigration detention, so that people who are going to be released, or maybe I think less and less people could be detained in the first place if there's a time limit, and then there should be a system how we are going to manage those people, and that's where alternatives to detention will come, and probably we'll be discussing that
Yeah, well, that's the perfect moment to discuss this issue, because we've already mentioned this issue of a time limit. So one way of thinking about having a legitimate version of detention is thinking, well, maybe it would involve a time limit, but now we've brought up this issue that, well, there are plenty of other countries that do have time limits and still have problems. So I want to ask you all, do you think there's a legitimate version of this? And if not, what are the alternatives to a system of detention? Should we start with you, Matt?
Sure. So it's pretty clear, why we need legitimation of this, first of all, it's important to remind us of, is because what's being infringed upon here is the basic liberty rights of people. And within liberal societies, they're supposed to be defined by their protection of the basic liberty rights of individuals, and that is supposed to be taken as something that's very serious indeed, as well as those liberty rights that constrain people from enjoying other rights like freedom of association, freedom to be with their family, freedom to work, freedom to move freely about, communicate with others, to kind of make life plans, to control their days as they unfold. We also know a lot about trauma and things like that associated with detention as well. So, therefore, we have to ask, is that liberty infringement justified by the end at stake here? We often judge that sometimes liberty infringements are justified by the end in terms of criminal punishment, for example. And that end, as commonly put, is maintaining the integrity of border controls in the state. So if we look at that from an ethical perspective, we find that political philosophers and normative theorists that look at that question differ radically on that question about whether border controls themselves, controls on the movement of people, are themselves morally justified. A lot of political theorists and political philosophers believe that people should be able to move freely between societies, and to stop them doing so is to violate a fundamental human right. So for those people, I think you can say almost immediately, there could be a few qualifications here, but almost immediately that they're going to find detention morally indefensible in almost any circumstance here. But there are other philosophers that would defend the right of states to control their borders and would use various arguments. And it is a widely accepted principle in the public and in international law. So then it's worth asking a set of questions about under what circumstances it could be legitimate if we do accept that states have some rights to control the entrance of non-citizens onto their territory. And I think then the questions that we need to ask, and the questions that I would ask, is first of all whether detention is necessary as a practice. Are there other ways of maintaining border integrity here? Some people have talked about tagging people, others have talked about more open detention centres, and monitoring arrangements may actually serve the same goals, and no doubt that will emerge as a question about whether detention itself is even necessary. Another question is, does detention as practiced in this state actually really serve the end, the stated end, that the state puts forward to it of maintaining the integrity of border controls? Now, Mishka has rightly made the point that lots of people are released from detention after a certain period back into the community. So in those circumstances, it doesn't seem to be facilitating deportation or removal from the state. And also, one would think as well that if that end and its serving would be so clear, why shouldn't the judiciary or some independent body make the decision on whether people should be detained in those circumstances? So that's a second question. The third and final question, and I'm sure there are others, but the third and final question I would ask is whether the liberty infringement is proportionate to the end involved here. There are certain things we can't do to people even for the sake of operating border control policies. We can't just shoot them to stop them coming in, I hope. And if we look at the practices of the British state and British governments in other realms, if we take, if we draw an analogy perhaps between the holding of terrorist suspects without charge, you cannot hold those people for longer than 48 days, right? Now, let's compare the end to control of controlling the integrity of borders with the end of making sure that people are not blown up on the streets of this city, and look at the discrepancy between the two. Again, Mishka mentioned people that have been in detention for over 2 years here, and yet it's quite clear that people suspected of terrorist offences cannot be held without charge for say, anything like that period. There's a huge discrepancy here that's explicable solely, I think, or largely at least, in terms of the fact that we're dealing with non-citizens. So I wouldn't rule out that there could be very narrowly defined circumstances where for a short period perhaps people could be detained or perhaps held. But I think that there's no way in which the current policies or anything approaching them could be legitimated ethically from my perspective.
Thank you very much. Because I guess some people might be thinking the problem with the system that we have is that various people get caught up in it and are criminalised as a result of it. But somebody like Priti Patel might say, well, the system is designed to deal with people who shouldn't be in this country, and some people might feel like, well, there are particular individuals who fit within that category, for example, people who've been convicted of serious crimes. Yeah. So might it be relevant here to deal with different categories separately?
Well, it's possible, and I suppose people that have been convicted of crimes is one of the kind of central questions where perhaps you might want to argue that they are some kind of special case here. You might want to look at the nature of the crimes that people have actually been convicted here and not necessarily accept at face value the description that we're always dealing with serious criminals here. And we might also want to look at the potential and the ability of the state to deport those people before the end of their sentence or perhaps at the end of their sentence rather than holding them in detention. If we talk about people who have the right to remain in the state and can't be deported, perhaps citizens, they're released in some ways into the community. We have to move there. They're sometimes very slowly through, say, a lot of processes. But we have at least some ways for dealing with such people. I'm not saying that that isn't an issue that raises some particular complications, but we need to approach it by taking seriously the value of liberty involved here and not just creating a situation where there's a kind of double punishment involved, where people serve their time and then have to serve more time. Because foreign national prisoners, remember, are often also the most difficult people to deport. So they often make up, a substantial proportion of people in immigration detention for long periods.
Thank you.
Well, I think that you can give a quicker answer, which is just it's just that we didn't used to do it. It's unlike, say, the prison. We didn't used to detain people really until about 1993, which is when they started using camps. But of course, there are other historical moments during wars when they rounded people up who were from enemy countries. But immigration detention, as we sort of have it now, really is pretty recent, and the scale is very small. The vast majority of people who are in the country who have no immigration status to remain are not detained. They are managed with all of these other mechanisms. So this idea of alternatives to detention, most people are handled through alternatives. Mainly they're handled through reporting mechanisms. And mainly reporting mechanisms work. So I think there is this question, obviously we should have discussions about liberty and the importance of liberty and why we might have a different threshold of our expectations of that for people who don't have the same citizenship as we do. However, I think there's just a kind of much more simple way of approaching it, which is that these are very small numbers. We haven't always done it. We have a lot of evidence that it's very harmful, it's very expensive, it's harmful also for the officers who work in the industry. How much more evidence do we need? There are things that could be done and that are done, and so why not just widen those options? And I think, actually, to be fair, that is what is happening at the moment. I think the significant decrease in the population, the closure of a number of the centres, it's not that the numbers of people being processed has reduced, it's just that actually the use of custody is currently going down.
And do we have an answer to the question of why the use of custody is currently going down?
Well, I think the two main reasons are both the effect of the Shaw Review. So there's been a lot of sort of high-profile analysis of detention centres, and also the discussion of the Windrush generation, and so the sort of mistakes, the errors that were made where people who actually did have a right to citizenship were being detained, and so this notion that these centres are simply for people without British citizenship was shown not to be true. So I think both of those two cases, and in many regards, it's very positive news, really, because they're quite different, and the sort of groundswell of opinion around both of them was quite different. So around the Windrush, there was a lot of activism, a lot of community activism, also, of course, journalism. Around the Shaw Review, a lot of it has been kind of technical and technocratic, and engagement also by the Home Office and by the providers. And I think sort of having all of that discussion has actually had a visible effect. Now, I'm not sure we could be confident it will last forever, and the effect of Brexit and the creation of a whole new population of people who are going to be subject to fairly stringent immigration laws may inspire the government to reopen some of the centres that they've closed. But it does seem to me we're at a particular historical juncture where the population is so small that you could actually think quite creatively, quite quickly about managing people.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I would talk about three things. I'm keeping in mind I was asked one question, so I didn't answer the question, but I will come to that. I will answer your question. I think first thing, like Mary mentioned, I hear this one phrase which has been used as a slogan by immigration minister. Especially they say, when it comes to people who are subjected to immigration control or who are liable to removal, 95% of those people are never detained. So she comes up with that argument, and that means, okay, let's say 5% is 24,000 per year, and out of that you have to, you are basically going to release 60% of that, and then we have to basically consider, is it necessary? So you have a system that's not serving its intended purpose. In the meantime, there are many other issues like the incalculable human cost and then the financial cost. So I think it's definitely time has come, given that we are kind of seeing some reductions or some improvements in when it comes to this immigration detention area. I think it's time has come for the government to probably focus more on alternatives to immigration detention, so that even that 5% that they eventually release 60% of 60% out of that 5%, do we even need to maintain a detention state, given that it has like a massive human cost, financial cost? And when it comes to, government always say, they come up with, they try to tally, compare they often say, I don't like to use this word, they say, okay, let's say people who have committed a crime. Sometimes they use a word, I don't like to use the word, okay, they say we need immigration detention to remove these people. We believe, okay, it's like this. And first of all, we have to understand that the criminal justice system and the administrative convenience of the Home Office are two different things. Let's say if a British person commit a crime, they have committed a crime, once they have served their sentence, the person is going to be released into the public, the person is going to live in the community, or maybe the person will go through rehabilitation process. And when it comes to people, foreign national offenders, in this case, the recent Jamaica Charter flight highlighted a significant issue. People who have been living in this country since they were children were subjected to deportation. I see the Home Office say these people have done major crimes. At the end of the day, I believe they have served their sentence. In the meantime, it's wholly disproportionate to take away from their families, children. At the meantime, 2007 UK's Border Act made it like automatic deportation for anyone who has served a 12-month sentence. So in this country, if you break it down, a person who has let's say if a person a simple driving license offense can end up for a migrant a 12-month prison sentence. So are we going to deport someone who has been living in this country, and then for the purpose of that person to give them double punishment, leaving that person in detention for maybe for an indefinite time period? So we have to think of those things, even though the government say, what the government says, I believe we do not have to buy it at face value, because at the end of the day, the idea is to justify the system, what's ongoing. So, but if we break it down, we feel like, we will understand, we will understand the realities around it. This, basically are much different compared to what the government is presenting. In the meantime, we have to think with an open mind when it comes to removing people who have served their sentence. The government say we have criminals in detention, but we do not have criminals. Instead, we have people who have served their sentence. And to answer your question, I am keeping in that mind, I would say detention is a place where your liberty is restricted. You are taken away from your liberty. In the meantime, your access to justice is severely restricted. That's also another thing we basically saw when it comes to this recent Jamaica Charter flight. So I'm going to use an example. Let's say I hope many of you all know there was a significant number of news around this Jamaica charter flight. So those people did not have access to lawyers because there was an issue with the, a particular type of SIM card, let's say O2. I'm not promoting O2, okay? So, but let's say, if you were not in immigration detention, for those people, they could have walked just 1 kilometer. They can have signal, but since they are isolated, they are kind of locked up in that environment within those four walls. They couldn't do it. In the meantime, they could have just go and made their solicitor in person, but they couldn't do it because their movement were restricted. As a result, access to justice was restricted as well. For people in immigration detention, I believe like quite a lot of people, or probably most of the people, they do not want to leave the UK for a plethora of reasons. So people people cannot go back to their country of origin for a plethora of reasons. So, but in a setting like that, people are quite stressed, and it can come to the stage where people can be pushed from the edge to the point they can feel like trying to commit suicide is the only way around. So that's the environment I can describe. In the meantime, you asked one question about how, if we compare to prison-like setting, I would say it's almost a prison-like setting. We have some centers who are like Cornbrook. I believe they are almost category B prisons, and there are some, some centers like Harmersworth. But at the end of the day, even if you make those centers like 7-star or 5-star hotels, still you are locked up and your liberty is severely, I would say, deprived of your liberty. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I'd like to invite the audience to join us now. I know there are lots of questions. We've got one at the front here. I'll wait for the roving mic to come down. So I see one at the front. I saw one just behind, and we'll go to you after that. So 1, 2, 3. Okay. If we could keep the questions as short as possible so that the panel have plenty of time to respond. Thank you.
My question is to you. I would like to know exactly, as a campaign...
Is it on?
Oh, sorry. As a campaigner, I would like to know what exactly your profession is. Are you a lawyer? And how you see that... I'm assuming that you are very, very involved and you are talking to people detained, and how you see their situation there. Do you think that Home Office officials are treating them fairly, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do they behave in any inappropriate way towards them? That's why I want to know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And just behind you. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My question is, what is the role of the private sector in immigration detention in the UK?
Thank you. And question over here, and if we can keep it quite short as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, two snappy questions. The first one is, there's a lot of talk of people of serving their sentence, but no mention of early release. In other words, their sentence wasn't completed, they were just going to be released early. So in fact, they still should have been in prison. And that was highlighted by two rather unpleasant characters being automatically released and committing crimes almost straight away. British citizens, I hasten to add. The second question is, a lot of talk of double punishment, but aren't immigrants under two obligations, not one? One obligation is we all have to obey the law, but the second one as a guest. In the same way, I have an extra obligation because I'm not at home, I'm a guest of the LSE at the moment. So two obligations, not one.
Thank you very much. Do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I will ask you a question. First of all, I'm not a lawyer, but I do a lot of campaigns around immigration detention, and that's where I learn much about immigration detention, including my first-hand experience.
I want to know how did you get so knowledgeable about all that, and in which way you represent those people, and how can you protect them, and in which way do you see Home Office officials treating them nice,
Yeah, first of all, when I wanted to become a campaigner, so I wanted to kind of challenge the traditional ways of using expert by experience, because I didn't agree with the traditional way where people with lived experience are kind of used as tokens. So I thought, of course, I have my first-hand experience of immigration detention. In the meantime, I'm going to focus around the bigger picture as well, the general issues, learn about the policies, the very set of policies that directly affected me, so that I know what I'm talking about in the meantime, so that it helps me to see the issue not only around my personal experience. So, but in the meantime, we have like quite a lot of training with Freed Voices, and we get constant support by Detention Action. So in terms of answering your question by, how the Home Office is treating people, like I mentioned, first of all, let's say if we make detention centers like 5-star hotels, at the end of the day, you still have the issue of, deprivation of liberty and restricted access to justice. A point will come, people will be eventually pushed over over the edge. There are like major issues when it comes to healthcare in immigration detention, and some people, I cannot describe my personal experience because it hasn't been not that bad when it comes to treatment by people officers in detention. But for some people, they have quite bad experiences by the hand of the Home Office staff, in the meantime by the hand of the immigration detention staff. So, but whether I would say some people try to commit suicide. So probably that's an indication whether these people have been treated fairly by the hand of the authorities, by the hand of the system, as well as by the hand of the immediate environment they are, because I don't think someone will try to choose that as an option if they are being treated fairly.
Thank you. And sorry, excuse me, I have to move on. Thank you. I'm going to, if I may, funnel the questions. So if I could ask you, Mary, about the private sector involvement, and then I'll ask you, Matt, about the double punishment. Thank you.
That was the one I wanted.
So the British system is wholly a contracted out system. So what that means is that all of the institutions are contracted out to different custodial firms. The prison service currently runs one, so that's Morton Hall, which is in the middle of the country, up near Leicestershire. Nottingham, sorry, I'm not very good at geography. And then the private sector custodial firms run the others. Currently, it's G4S, Serco, Geo, and Mighty. And that's the British system. Other systems are not like that. So France, the detention centres are run by the Police aux Frontières, so they're border police who run the centres. In Greece, it's also the police. In Australia, it's contracted out, but it's contracted out to one provider, so Serco runs all of them. The US has got a number of providers, and they also hold people in prison. So different countries have different systems. It seems to be Anglo-American countries, so Australia, Canada, and the US use private sector, and then other countries use their own public sector. And it's interesting to try and figure out what the difference might be, and whether is it a different experience to be in Morton Hall, where your detention custody officers are actually prison officers, and so go through prison officer training and have careers in the prison service and might see themselves one day, being a prison governor, than it might be to be detained in a centre where the detention custody officers are Serco, or Serco for this contract, but then might be a different provider in the next contract. So yeah, that's how it works.
Thank you.
So, on the question of the two obligations, it's a very good question, I think. The idea of the two obligations works on the idea that the person is simultaneously bound by the rules of society, and that they're also, secondly, a guest in that society, and that's certainly the understanding with which the British government works. The idea of the guest grows out of a certain, I suppose it's connected powerfully to the idea that states again have the right to control their borders, the moral right to do so, and anyone coming in is a guest in that context. I don't have, in some respects, in some circumstances, I don't have too much problem with that distinction, but there is a rather big moment in which I do have a problem with that distinction. You could challenge that distinction by saying, are people just guests when they come in, or are they right holders of some form? But anyway, let's just let's just deal with the big problem is, are people, non-citizens in the state, people that don't have citizenship, eternal guests in the state? Or do they, over time, transition to something else, being moral or societal members of the state in question? And this issue presses itself hard upon us in cases exactly like the Jamaican deportations that we've recently seen, but you can find examples of it almost every day across all Western countries where deportation power has come to be used increasingly, I think one could argue, against people who commit crimes that came to the societies as young people, grew up in those societies, have very much been shaped by those societies, may have even gone into school in those societies, and then it's claimed after acting like a citizen, talking like a citizen, living like a citizen, being shaped by the society in which they're a part, now they're treated as a guest. These people are what one legal theorist describes as kind of virtual nationals, or which the Australian court called aliens by the barest of threads. Now, to me, that's a legal distinction, and you can hold on to that and appeal to it, but I don't find it very compelling as a moral one.
Thank you. That does actually lead us nicely onto this final section of discussion, which is around the question of what detention tells us about the ethics of migration control more generally. So we've picked up on this theme of what citizenship means, what membership means. I wonder, Mishka, if you could start us off here on the ways in which movement is contained and controlled and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would start by saying, I see this, this false narrative. I personally see it as a false narrative. Immigration detention can act as a deterrent. But I believe it's not, because people migrate, first of all, for various reasons. It has been there. It's something natural. People move. And when it comes to immigration detention, first of all, we have to think, are we going to use immigration detention to control migration? In the meantime, you mentioned it's about restricted movement inside the centers. You basically mentioned, yes. And first of all, like we described, this system, the system which we currently have, has lots of major issues around it, and that's including the human cost, financial cost. In the meantime, we talk about many issues. So I think, like I mentioned, people move, and I do not think immigration detention act as a deterrent when it comes to this migration control, even though the government is basically highlighting it as a way of deterring migrants. And yeah, I would say...
Yeah, that's really helpful to think about, because, it's not going to act as a great deterrent if the fact is that people just move anyway and will always move.
Yes.
Plus, in order for it to be a deterrent, people have to actually know about it in advance. Thank you very much. Mary, if I could move on to you and just think about this question of what detention tells us about the ethics of migration control more generally.
It's a very difficult question. Because I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it's hard not to be very pessimistic. Because one way of talking about it would be words that Matt, I think, was already using before, which is to say that it suggests to us that certain people don't matter, that we are willing to pay, we're willing for them to pay a price, which we might not be willing to pay ourselves. And the problem with that way of speaking about it is that of course they matter. They matter to themselves, they matter to the people who know them, they matter to us. So it's hard to find the right form of words, I think, to talk about institutions which we have a lot of evidence are very painful for the people in them and for the people who are concerned about them. I think that there are difficulties if you jump straight to the sort of counter argument, which is, well, if you're not going to have detention, are you going to have open borders. And I suspect that's a red herring, that we don't have to have open borders to not have detention. And I suppose one of the things I think about is about the historical development of detention centres. So they came about actually in the UK because there was a concern that members of the Commonwealth weren't being able to exercise their rights of due process if they were being turned back at the border. And so people wanted them to have an avenue for exercising their rights of appeal. And then they were like, well, if we're going to give them the rights of appeal, what will we do with them? Won't people just disappear? How we manage them? So initially it was, these were very, very small places. They were in the ports of arrival. They were really just designed as they really were truly just an administrative bureaucratic convenience, that you'd be there while they checked your papers and decided if you could enter or not. And then at various historical junctures, it kind of grew and grew and grew. It's still fairly small, but it did grow into a number of institutions and into a system. And it seems to me that there probably was a point where somebody could have said, hey, rather than use the decommissioned juvenile young offenders institution outside of Oxford for holding these people, why don't we put them into that school that's empty, or that sort of council housing development? And so you see how it ties into other discussions that either weren't had or perhaps were difficult to have because we don't have enough housing anyway. So, we couldn't have put them into council housing. But I think we've sort of ended up in a situation which early on was not at all inevitable. And then the question really becomes for us is, do we want to stick with this system, or are we actually imagining that there could be something which was radically quite different, and what would it take to get there?
That's really fascinating. I mean, I'm going to ask a difficult question. But you mentioned that it would be wrong just to jump straight from the idea that detention might be problematic and we might have alternatives to that, all the way to the idea that therefore there must be open borders or something like that. And I think that's absolutely right. But then the examples that you mentioned were around the state deciding who gets to enter. So, at the port, we could have the bureaucrat or whoever it is who says, no, you can't enter, and then we don't have the issue of detention. But what about the state's control over who gets to stay? So once people are already in, and then for whatever, they've overstayed their visa, or, they've committed some crime, and the state decides, right, well, now we don't want to facilitate your eventual membership. So at that point, is there a connection between a kind moving away from detention and moving more towards the idea that once people are in and they're settled, then they just have to be they just have to be allowed to stay?
Well, yeah, I think so. I also really think we shouldn't, in these conversations, always have crime in the picture, because you don't lose your membership if you're a citizen if you commit a crime. And, once upon a time, yes, you were sent to Australia, but that was a long time ago. So we don't do that anymore. We came back. Sorry, guys.
We came back here tonight.
So crime shouldn't. I don't really think that crime should have an effect on your right to membership, and so unless it's going to have a right on our membership as well. So I wasn't quite sure that I fully understood the other part of the question.
Well, the suggestion was that there's one aspect of open borders would be control, an alternative to control at the moment of entry, but another aspect of it is who gets to stay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that states claim a right to do is decide who gets to be a member.
Right, but I still think that could be separated from detention. You could still have a process about who gets to stay that doesn't require detention, because that is what we do for most people.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay, so I've really enjoyed the comments from both you, Mishka, and Mary, and my kind of role is to be more broad and sweeping and unevidenced. But I suppose what it tells me and what I draw from this, the ethics and politics, is what actually controlling borders really involves in the contemporary world. We, particularly political philosophers and I suppose even a lot of members of the public, when we think about immigration control, we tend to think about the territorial borders of the state and letting people in. We kind of, I suppose, even use the kind of analogy in some ways of the wall, where people are prevented from doing something, but after that they're left to go on and live their lives as they were. It may be devastating to be prevented from entering, but it doesn't necessarily impinge upon other questions, particularly if we put issues of refugees aside here, that there are other cases there as well. But once we start bringing detention into the picture, our view changes of what the state is doing here. It's not a wall so much as a prison that we're talking about. And the state isn't just, I suppose, preventing people from doing things. It's actually in the position of being a tyranny over certain members of the non-citizen population. It's taking away their liberty and doing so under conditions that are highly legally dubious, without any kind of with very little independent oversight, and for not committing a crime. So for me, it suggests that at least while we maintain this, I agree it's an open question as to whether there are alternatives around it, but it's a deep problem for liberal thinkers here, immigration, detention. And there's another problem here too, and that is, and here I draw from other work that I've done, but we've also seen examples of it mentioned tonight. The way we treat non-citizens here starts to bleed into the way we treat other members in the state. Now, one example of this, you could say an accidental example, or largely an accidental example, is the Windrush case, where people are detained and deported who are undoubtedly members of the British polity. And if you look at the work of Jackie Stevens in the US, she has plenty of other examples how the US system drags citizens into it who can't prove their identity and actually have been deported over the years too. But an area that I work on where you really see the effects of these kinds of actions that treat non-citizens as not full legal subjects is the area of denationalisation, the area of deprivation of citizenship, of stripping citizenship, which has flourished in this country. And Mary said before, she thought, it's unfair to treat non-citizens as if they should be deported if they commit a crime when we don't do the same for citizens. But we are starting to do the same for citizens. And it's not just terrorists either. The Rochdale Four have been stripped of their citizenship in this country. We do not know where this is heading. And it reminds us just of a kind of old, again, an old liberal idea that the rights of all of us are kind of interconnected here. And I think that detention is a pretty powerful way of kind of concentrating our minds on the kind of erosion of rights within, even if I do accept Mary's point that for the time being, it's decreasing. It concerns a relatively small number of people, but I would say that it still acts as a kind of apt illustration.
Thank you all. And we've got 10 minutes left, so I'd like to invite you to join us with some more questions. I'll take a few, and then we'll come back to the panel for final words. So I see a question there with the yellow hat, and then I'll come to the white jumper, and then I'll come one at the front in green. Thank you.
So just going back to what Matt said about how the state is using immigration detention as a means of exercising its symbolic power, I wanted to see how plausible you thought it was that perhaps the inhumane treatment of non-members is a way of controlling members. So just by what you were going there about how the rights of all are connected, could it be that the way we treat non-members is the way that the state polices members?
Sorry, I missed that last bit. The state
policing members.
police members.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. And white jumper. There we are. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have just a question about the situation, like the very recent migration deal between Italy and Libya. Just to know, like, how far can we go with, like, accountability of Europe and, like, Italy itself in this particular situation?
Can I squeeze one more question in? You had a question, didn't you, back there? If you stick your hand up, wait, behind you. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring up Bosworth. I was quite surprised that it hasn't been mentioned. And so, especially Mary's point about why perhaps policy has changed. From an activist viewpoint, I think that, especially I was a student back then, and there was a big protest around that. So I just thought perhaps it's worth mentioning and discussing.
Thank you. And finally, here at the front, if we may, I think that's all we'll be able to squeeze in. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was wondering we touched upon it already, the difference between the judicial system and the immigration system. So it seems to me that with immigration, the Home Office and the immigration system is much more freer. People are often dehumanized. It feels like a tick box exercise. You tick the wrong boxes, that's it. Well, with the judicial system, there seem to be much more safety nets in place. So is there any way that can be improved under this government?
Thank you. There are 4 really interesting questions there. Who wants to start us off?
I can ask her question.
Yes.
Your question. Yeah, I mean, I would say when it comes to people in immigration detention, I believe the safeguards for those people are even less compared to, in some ways, people navigating the criminal justice system as well. In this case, I mean, when it comes to criminal justice system, we have like judges involved. But whereas in immigration detention, the Home Office, a caseworker, basically acts as the judge and the jury. So that sometimes, I mean, as a result, people can be detained by a tick box, like you mentioned, by the hand of a caseworker. That means it's basically about, and of course, I mean, then again, the lack of a time limit comes. Let's say, I mean, when it comes to criminal justice system, if someone is sentenced, the person is going to be sentenced for a specific time period. That's why people say while you are in prison, you count your days down. While you are in immigration detention, you count your days up. So when it comes to, that's why we believe, of course, I mean, there should be more definitely independent or judicial oversight when it comes to I mean, decisions to detain people in the first place, so that there will not be arbitrary detention, as well as judges should be involved throughout the process, so that even if there's a time limit, I mean, like we discussed, 28-day time limit is not going to be the maximum time limit. If there's any judicial oversight in between, maybe a person can be released in 2 days' time. I'm not talking about being released. We are talking about the giving back someone's liberty that has been lost through an administrative process. So in that, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, when it comes to people navigating the immigration system, especially this country has a massive focus on immigration control, and the immigration control overpowers many things, and that's including basic humanity, because this country has a huge focus on immigration control. So that's why, I mean, people who are basically detained in immigration detention centers under immigration powers, they in certain ways have less safeguards compared to criminal justice system as well, and less judicial oversight, because at the end of the day, the people who are focusing on migration control, when they are given powers to detain people for that purpose, I don't think we can expect much independency from them.
Thank you. And it sort of taps into some of the things that you've all already been highlighting about the contradictions in the system, because on the one hand, we've got the system designed to facilitate people's removal, and so people are treated as sort of dispensable and not worthy of investment. And yet, at the same time, so many people are then released into the community. So what's going on?
Yes.
Matt?
Yeah, so just a little bit on the second question, and I think the last question, which I would probably want to connect about how this impacts upon citizens and this distinction between the judiciary and the immigration sides of, I suppose, detention or those two types of power. I suppose, I mean, first of all, that's why I brought up the issue of deprivation of citizenship, because I think if you look at something like that, the stripping of citizenship, you see it is effectively an extrajudicial power. It doesn't go through a court. It's made by the Home Secretary. In some ways, it's kind of modelled on this way in which we treat non-citizens. Now, there's a long history of that. I'm not saying it's a new thing, but it's been treated outside the parameters of it. It has an appeal right, but it's an appeal right that can be easily brushed aside if you're overseas and you only, I think you have... now I've forgotten the amount of time. I think it's 4 weeks in which to appeal. If you don't make it by that time, you're finished. And it's very, very hard to be successful in that appeal, right, certainly on the merits in those circumstances. So I would just say that there has been this kind of movement over to that realm. The other point I would make is that it's kind of helpful to think about someone like Chandran Kukathas's work here, who was a professor here at this... at the LSE, exactly. And sorry, I'm just reminding myself where we are. I always pause slightly as a sign of respect to the institution, as an Oxford person. So
it's like the rock stars who say, Manchester, good evening.
And I mean, he constantly makes the point about how immigration controls don't just impact upon non-citizens, they impact upon citizens all the time. And in this realm of the of detention and the whole apparatus that goes around with that, like the hostile environment, citizens are impacted upon. Who's in detention? Sometimes people that are married to British citizens. Sometimes people who have British citizen children. They're the ones affected by this process too. It has a kind of dramatic effect on their lives. And of course, who's implicated in the practices of detention too? All of us are, to the extent in which we are enlisted into the process of border control as academics, as medical health workers, as landlords into the hostile environment too. So I think there's a way in which those distinctions and connections start to break down at a certain point.
Thank you. I'm afraid Mary only has 1 minute, but you have the last minute.
Oh. Go for it, Mary.
I'm
still standing.
I just wanted to also just to reiterate that when we're talking about the effect on members, we should be quite clear that we're talking about ethnic minority communities in particular. So that the sort of detention, the racialized nature of detention, will be having a direct effect on particular parts of the community and also in other sorts of practices. So the police, as they check people's immigration status, we have a lot of evidence that they actually are checking British citizens, but British citizens who look like they might be foreign to a police officer. Yarls Wood, just to sort of bring up the issue about women in detention, I think that clearly the activism around Yarls Wood is also very much part of the activism which is having some effect on policies. I do also think, however, that one of the times when the activism around Yarls Wood was most effective was when it was about children. And that just gives us a sort of slightly depressing note to end on, which is that when you can kind of build up this virtuous subject, we don't want to harm children in detention, then women enter the picture. If you're saying we have a bunch of women in detention, some of whom may have committed offences, some of whom have done these other things, then suddenly it's harder to create public sympathy. And I think that's where the Windrush case was so effective, because it was able to bypass a kind of virtue hierarchy, and it was just shown to be something that didn't fit with a sort of British national idea of its own self. And that was used very effectively. And so, I mean, yes, all the Islewood activism, the Women for Refugee Women, all of the groups are very much part of the discussion. But I think once the kids dropped out, then they had to kind of rebuild some of the activism so that people were actually concerned also about women, not just women as mothers, and in the usual way. And we didn't talk about Italy and Libya, and that's partly because I suspect none of us quite have enough knowledge about that.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for those fantastic questions. As Mary said, we're at this pivotal moment for detention. On the one hand, the estate's going down. On the other hand, we'll see what's going to happen now with Brexit. But I'd like to thank our panel for a really rich and informative discussion of this difficult topic.